So Gen Z, in order to put together this research, we went digging in the higher education literature. This is the place where Gen Z has been for the last 4 years and has been being prepped and prepared to come into the workforce. So they've been doing their initial analyses and studies of what Gen Z thinks, what they want in their careers, and how they're going to prepare them for those careers. And so what we have here is a good summary of a lot of different bits of research on what this next generation is planning. And their plans, I don't think, are going to make you particularly happy. So who is Gen Z? So Gen Z, is people who are now, who were born between 1995 and 2010. So so many of them are children. But about 4 years of that are either in college and serving as interns in your organizations, or are right now graduating and preparing to have full-time jobs. To your question of how the other generations line up, so if we're just talking in terms of ages, millennials are 22 to 36 right now, Gen X is 37 to 51, and boomers are 52 to 70. So that gives you a sense of the span of the different generations. And while I've given you these different age brackets, the reality is generations are fuzzy. People came up with the idea and sort of broke it up into 15-year blocks, but they overlap each other. So the youngest member of one generation isn't that different from the oldest member of the generation following. So there's going to be some fuzz. And over the course of the next few years, you're going to hear people just talking about young millennials and how something seems to be changing, but they can't quite put their finger on it. And then a couple years later, it's going to explode and everyone's going to know what it is. But by then, you'll be ready for it because you've come to today's presentation. So in thinking about the size of this generation, they're about 26% of the US population right now. So that makes Gen Z actually bigger than either the boomers or the millennials on their own. So they are going to be a next big wave in deciding marketing, employees, and really thinking about what sets the norm for American society. So why do we talk about generations? Well, the whole idea behind generations is the idea that people experience different things through their lifetime that set their expectations for what their lives are going to be like. In basic psychology, the boomers are no different than Gen Z. They're no different than Gen X. Humans are humans. But human psychology is adaptive. And that means what you're exposed to shifts how you apply those particular psychological constructs. And so one of the things that I find most instructional in understanding the difference between generations is the idea of, are they a boom or a bust mindset? So I define a boom mindset as a generation that goes into their adulthood expecting to thrive. They think jobs will be available. They feel like they have good parental support. They're not really worried or scared. A bust generation, or a bust mindset, is one that expects things to be difficult. They're planning for hard times. They don't think they have a lot of parental support, and they're worried about what's going to come next. So when we think about the different generations, they each fall differently into this type of mindset. So if we start with the boomers came into the workforce at a time with great manufacturing and technology advances for their generation. There was a sense that there were going to be jobs right out of high school. So there was a definite sense of boom after World War II. Things were looking up for them when they were coming into their adulthood. From there, we move to Gen X. Gen X is a generation known for being the latchkey kids. They're the generation that was called slackers the moment they arrived in the workforce. In many ways, they have also experienced the recession at the time of their greatest earning. For them, life has always been a kind of a struggle in order to thrive. Millennials go back to being boomers in the sense of they are the children of the boomers. And they also came into the workforce thinking that they were going to have a great time. They were going to transform the industries. There were so many job opportunities. And then the recession hit, and their whole worldview just didn't match. They were expecting opportunity, and they came across hardship. And so I think a lot of what goes on between boomers and millennials is based in a millennial sense of betrayal at expecting one thing and then having a world that was actually very, very different. When we look to Gen Z, they're the children of Gen X. So they've been prepared for a world that's going to be hard. Gen X is a generation that is particularly financially strapped right now. They are a generation that has been building more reliance in their children than the boomers did. So the boomers were much more day-to-day involved in their children's lives. When we look at how Gen Z and their Gen X parents interact, it's a lot more consultative. So the parents will say, you know, I think you should do this, but I really don't have the resources to force you to do it in the way that boomer-millennial relationships seem to have functioned. And so Gen Z ends up being a lot more with the sense of, I kind of got to figure out what I'm going to do for myself. And they're being told by their parents, you're not going to be really supported by the economy. Look to the generation right before you. That was their experience. Plan for problems. And we see this in a gut level when we think about the media that's been popping up right now around Gen Z youth. So we have movies like The Hunger Games, the Allegiance series, the Scorch Trials. If any of you have Gen Z children, you probably have bumped into these. If not, the things that unify these different movies are the idea of heroes and heroines that don't have mentors. They are in societies where there's a lot of possible opportunity, but it's unevenly divided. They have to go up and rebel to do things on their own. Well, if you think about some of the previous versions of these movies, you'd have a Yoda who'd be guiding the young person. There's no Yodas. There's no mentors. This is all I'm on my own, and if anything, the people above me want to either exploit me or throw me away. There's also a lot about testing in these movies. There's the Hunger Games, Legion, all of it's, are you good enough? Can you join the society? Do you not join the society? And I think that ties back to a lot of their experiences with constant testing as children. So when we think about Gen Z, they've been pretty much set up with an idea of, I'm on my own, and I'm going to have to figure this out. So
I see a difference there between Y and Z. That is more of a, I am not, this is not just about me thing that Z has. It's more about my environment as well.
I think that's been an ongoing trend. So millennials have a little bit of that going on as well. There's much more of a sense of being part of a larger society. Gen Z also has it. They're also very engaged with diversity. They're a much more diverse generation than the generation before them, the generation before them. So I think that's more of a trend through time than a specific generational thing. So as I said, a lot of the research that's been going on is thinking about what Gen Z is going to be looking for in their careers. So one of the things that really pops is they have a strong sense of economic insecurity. And that has resulted in some very interesting statistics. So studies have found that almost 2/3 of Gen Z say that big organizations control too much of America. 1/4 believe they need to get through school without debt. 63% want to learn entrepreneurship in college and plan for being their own bosses. Overall, 42% expect to work for themselves one day. That is 4 times higher than the actual percentage of people who are working for themselves in the US today. And that figure goes up even higher when we start talking about African American and Hispanic youth. So about 60% of African Americans and 59% of Hispanics expect to work for themselves, but only 31% of whites do. So we have a definite difference in this idea of, can I join this larger organizational hierarchy and thrive? So this is also important to be thinking about in comparison to millennials. So when you think of the millennial generation, they came into the workforce thinking they were going to transform the places that they came to. Gen Z is planning to survive when they leave. Yeah, so Gen Z is planning to be your competitors. They're not planning to be the perfect employee. So millennials jump from company to company. Gen Z is planning to found their own. And we see a lot of support for this. I was just poking around the internet and like, let's see 18-year-olds starting businesses. There's an organization called the Thiel Foundation, which actually gives grants to young people to skip college and start their own business. There's a great example of somebody who's 18 years old, just built a modular drone business and has just launched it this past year. And so that is what Gen Z is planning for. They're planning to be their own bosses and your competitors. So if you're thinking about what to do to connect with Gen Z, you need to kind of do two things. One, you need to connect with them early so that you can overturn this expectation that large organizations are not the place to be. How do I make employment something that they want? Internships is going to be something I'm going to talk about a little bit later. It's going to be important. You also want to make sure that you're thinking about ways to support entrepreneurship. If they want to run their own business, be the founding investor in that company. Let them start their own business, but make sure that your organizations are benefiting from that energy. And you might actually find that there's an advantage to that, in that entrepreneurial thinking can sometimes get stuck in a hierarchy. But if you can sort of have these branches that are thinking independently and sort of fold them back in later, your organizations could potentially reap some real advantages from Gen Z's interest in being their own bosses. Communication is another place where Gen Z is going to sort of shake things up a bit. So we've had a long-term move towards more use of digital devices. I mean, you see it in the picture, everybody's looking at their cell phones. They're not actually looking at each other's faces. What's been found is that Gen Z, and to some extent the younger millennials, are engaged with technology as a communication tool in a way that older generations are not. It's not just, I pick up the phone and I call you. I'm using the phone to show you facts and figures I just looked up as we were talking. I want to pull up a video so that you can see something rather than me having to sketch it. They don't see the technological device as separating them from the other person. They see it as part of the language that they're speaking. And so when we think about that and how older generations respond, you see somebody looking at their phone, you feel like they're disrespecting you. They should be making eye contact. They should be engaging. In their heads, they're actually engaging even more because they're showing what they want to say better than if they just tried to say it out loud. And so when we think about what we should be doing with Gen Z, we should first stop and break certain stereotypes. They like having the person-to-person interaction, but the phone is a part of it. Only about 15% say they would prefer to communicate only digitally. So it's not just about having that face-to-face conversation. It's also about engaging through that device as a real mechanism. And so you should be pulling this concept into your diversity and inclusion programs and thinking about this as employees who speak a different language, not employees who are broken and don't know how to communicate respectfully. And that may take some conversations with your leadership to help them think about the use of these phones not as a sign of disrespect, but as something that they need to fold into their business and recognize that eventually Gen Z will be running their businesses and this will be the norm. So better to be ahead of the curve than falling behind. Learning. So one thing that often gets said about learning is that people today learn differently. As a psychologist, I really don't like that phrase because people don't change on a generational framework. You don't evolve new ways of fundamentally thinking on that rate. But we do evolve new ways of teaching. So the way in which you convey information has radically expanded. You can do it through online, through a video, through written text, through presentations. You can have live presentations with people in 2 different places. So there's a lot of different ways we can present information, but people still tend to absorb information in the same old ways. So one thing that you should be thinking about in terms of learning is not jumping on the digital bandwagons. There's some things that'll be useful through that mechanism. Other things won't. Some of the research has shown that Gen Z tends to cut a lot of corners in their research and understanding of things because they think that all information is at their fingertips. So they can just look it up on the internet, there's the answer. They tend not to dig very deep, and they tend not to give themselves enough time to dig very deep because they think they don't need it. And so when you're thinking about learning, you need to really focus on how do you get Gen Z to engage with content. One thing that you want to avoid with that engagement is setting them up in scenarios where there's competition. Again, because of all the years of competitive testing, they tend to be turned off when their learning is competitive in nature. They like learning on their own, and then sort of sharing with other people. So there's value in communication with other people, but if it's set up as this person might overtake you, they end up sort of withdrawing back into themselves and not being as effective as they might otherwise be.
Now, I would think that this group would be, said competitive, that be great at gaming, want to engage through gaming, but that would tell me that maybe not.
But gaming isn't just about do I beat someone else, it's also about do I win the award. So you can build a gaming scenario that's about personal growth as opposed to defeating my colleague. And so I think that's where the gaming piece becomes really powerful, because a lot of times people will spend their time in these games really on their own, just turning up achievements, and that's a burst of satisfaction from achieving a goal, as opposed to getting the satisfaction from defeating someone else. And let's see. Office design. So a lot of places have been rethinking how they structure their offices, looking for efficiencies in real estate, compressing spaces, creating open offices. On the one hand, with Gen Z, this is actually really good. They tend to prefer non-traditional workspaces. So one study points out that about 28% of Gen Z likes traditional, compared to 45% of millennials. So there's definitely growing focus on different ways and places for working. However, as I'll talk about in a slide a little bit further, Gen Z is also a generation that really values having multiple streams of information at the same time. And so if you put them in open office spaces, you run the risk of having them connecting to all the different things that are going on rather than focusing on the thing that they need to be paying attention to. So in terms of thinking about your real estate, you should be looking to what university libraries have been doing. They've been really innovative at creating new spaces for collaboration and independent work. If you go to a university library, they don't go to the library for books anymore. Everything's online, you can download text. What the library now serves as is a meeting place for students. They collect for group meetings and planning projects. They pop off into an individual room to do a private piece and then come back out. So the real estate, the structures that might be more effective for organizations working with Gen Z and collapsing their spaces may actually be in existence at your local university library. And the other really great thing is when you build your office spaces that way, they can really focus on housing your non-digital resources and providing meeting space that supplements people's working from home and allows you to keep your real estate small, but what you do own can have maximal effect for your organization. I mentioned earlier that Gen Z tends to have a more consultative relationship with their parents than the millennials did. And so what that means is there's a potential for conflict between millennials and Gen Z. I know usually we're talking millennials to boomers, but at this point we need to start thinking about how millennials are going to be engaging with the people that we're going to be asking them to start leading. And so if we think of millennials, they're often associated with the concept of the helicopter parent, the very involved parents who show up and solve problems for their young people. If they become the leaders of a generation that is consultative, that shows up and asks a question and then expects to go do things on their own, you have the potential for some conflict. Where the millennial says, okay, you came into my office and asked me a question, that's equal to you saying you want me to do it. Whereas Gen Z is like, no, I'm just asking you a question, and then I'm going to go off and make my own decision. And so leaders that are going to be managing Gen Z are going to have better coaching skills. They're going to have to be able to focus on how do I help you make your own decision as opposed to how do I absorb this onto myself. I think a lot of leaders will prefer that option because it means more time for them. But if your own experience is a lot more handing responsibility over to someone else, you may find that you stumble when somebody comes to you and says, I just want your opinion, I don't want you to do it. Well-being. So as I mentioned, Gen Z is a generation that really enjoys having multiple streams running at the same time. As a generation, they really fancy themselves to be high-end multitaskers. However, years and years of research have shown that there's no such thing as multitasking. There's just task switching. So can you jump from A to B back to A? Every time you jump, you lose a little bit of time. You lose a little bit of extra energy than if you just did it in a sequence. So we have a generation that has a great fear of missing out, has been brought up in having multiple streams, and has also been reported as having really low boundaries. So they are very comfortable taking a phone call from a friend late at night who's having a stressful day, but they also are very comfortable calling a professor in the middle of the night and saying, I'm having trouble with this math assignment, will you help me? And what that means is you're going to have a lot of leaders who are going to burn out really fast, where it's like, why are you calling me in the middle of the night? I'll just do it. No, I don't want you to do it. I just want your opinion. And that's going to be a well-being drain on your leaders. It's also going to be a well-being drain on them as they burn through their resources and support networks pretty quickly. So also, let's be honest, corporate life praises people who spread themselves pretty thin. So if you have a generation that's predisposed to touching lots of different places simultaneously, and a corporate environment that says the more things you can do, the better you are, you kind of have the recipe for a work-life problem. So in thinking about supporting Gen Z as they move into the workplace, managers should be providing significant clarity around deadlines, time management, and help them identify which corners should not be cut in order to make sure that they do good work. As I said earlier, Gen Z tends to believe that they have infinite amount of time to gather information because it's all at their fingertips, but they tend not to do a lot of work on integrating or checking the quality of the information that they're getting. And so if you have a Gen Zer who's working on a knowledge project, you may want to spend a little bit more time making sure that they know your standards for what is good work. Recruit early and reward with opportunity. So here is just a list of important things in thinking about how you're going to engage Gen Z with your companies. So first, Gen Z believes that the best rewards are enduring ones. So while with millennials, there was a tendency to give them little gifts like gift cards were really meaningful for them. They love to get the quote unquote trophy or prize. Gen Z doesn't care. I've spent some time talking to people who do internships, placements at universities, and they find that Gen Z, unlike the millennials before them, are obsessed with their resumes. If this is not going down on my resume, I don't want it. And they're like, this is a great experience, it'll develop you. I don't care. It needs to be on my resume because that's the rest of my life. And so when you're thinking about the kinds of rewards you offer them, they need to be things that are going to stick, that in a sense will endorse them for their next position and give them that sense of job security that they otherwise already lack. So degrees, certification, tuition reimbursement, these are going to be more valuable than just straight money. Because a job that pays a lot can go away, but a degree will stay with you even after you lose that job. And it'll help you get another one. Another important thing would be provide paid internships and co-ops. That helps a lot with diversity by giving people who otherwise couldn't afford to do an unpaid internship the opportunity to learn essential skills. But it's also going to allow you to have people come into the organization and see all the things that it really can be, as opposed to their fears that America, for example, that America is controlled by large corporations. So these are opportunities for you to bond with Gen Z and provide the practical experiences that their college educations are not yet providing them. And some research suggests that about 72% specifically want their college experiences to contain some degree of work-related content. Also, you should be making more use of rotations and practical trainings, again, because that sort of sticks in an organizational perspective. If their department becomes outdated and laid off, they know that they can jump to another part of the organization. So that helps keep them connected, and it expands their skills in a way that they're going to value. Practical skills training, like financial planning and savings advice, is another thing that Gen Z particularly values, and is another way you can enhance your compensation packages with opportunities for them to be better at what they have to do for themselves.